Welcome to the show, everyone. You've tuned into Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38, episode number 2. If this isn't the podcast you were looking for, well, just stick around anyway. We're going to have a lot of fun discussing episode number 2 of season 38 of The Amazing Race. After completing their first leg and getting a feel for how the race is played, the racers seem to have settled down a bit for the second leg. So let's talk about what happened on that second leg as the racers travel around on their European adventure. I'm your host, Jason Mogul. At the end of episode 1, in the Netherlands, we saw Jack and Enzo eliminated as the first team out. They ran at the back of the pack for nearly all of that leg due to their navigational struggles. So for episode number 2, that left 12 teams competing for the $1 million as they started their day with a fresh clue. Jazz and Jag were the first team to depart on a bright and sunny spring day at 10:59 a.m. The clue told them to travel to Prague. They would need to take a train traveling overnight through the Netherlands, then through Germany, and into the Czech Republic, into Prague. So off they went by taxi to the train station. Just 1 minute behind them, Tucker and Eric departed, and just 5 minutes behind them, Izzy and Paige started their day. The next racers, Christine and Rubina, left about an hour and a half after Izzy and Paige. The other teams followed, and as teams rode in the taxi to the train station, it gave some teams an opportunity to share a little bit about themselves for about 30 seconds. Megan and Matt were the last team to depart at 5:23 p.m. I had to look at that again. So they were almost 6.5 hours behind the leaders, Jazz and Jag. Remember, they had left at 11 a.m. earlier that same day. So if we look back to the previous leg when Phil said go, after the teams had already completed one task, the sled bowling, all of the teams were bunched up together and left at the same time. After completing the cheese ball task and then the flower picking task, Megan and Matt took 6.5 more hours to complete them than Jazz and Jag, since the time Phil said go. I just find that almost unbelievable. The clever editing didn't make that time gap evident to me in the first episode, but it's only when we see the teams depart for the next leg can we do the math to see that time gap. Teams arrived at the train station and learned the next available train for Prague left at 2 p.m. So right then we knew not all teams would make the first train. Angela and Lexi didn't leave the pit stop until 2:12 p.m., and they were in 10th place. That first team arrived in Prague at 9:23 a.m. the next morning. Switching trains would be required in Berlin and in Dresden, where they would spend the night. I'm not sure what that meant. Did they go to a Dresden hotel? Or sleep on the stopped train, which seems unlikely, or sleep in the Dresden station? Phil didn't go into that much detail on that. But the real focus and the mystery was how many teams would make it on that first 2 o'clock train. It turns out 8 of the 12 teams were able to get on that train. Tucker and Eric were so confident at this point in the race, they said they were coasting into Prague. Uh-oh. It seems to me the Amazing Race is setting them up for a fall sometime later in the race, with them making a comment like that. I couldn't determine when the next train left Amsterdam, but it arrived in Prague at the same time, 9:23 a.m. 3 of the 12 teams made it onto that train, and they were excited that it arrived at the same time as the first train. However, it took a different way. Instead of going to Berlin, the second train went through Frankfurt, Germany. Now, if you are an Amazing Race superfan, then you know that the Frankfurt airport has a particularly bad reputation for delaying racers, like with Abby and Ryan and the Beekman boys in season 21, and even further back in season 9 with Lake and Michelle. So when I heard the train was traveling through Frankfurt, I wondered if the train station would be as unlucky for the Amazing Racers as the airport had been. That left Megan and Matt, who didn't make the second train, but took another one that arrived in Prague at 10:22 a.m., about an hour later than the other teams. It goes through Regensburg, Germany, then to Prague. In many ways, that was a good thing. Having started the day 6.5 hours later than the leaders, this will allow them to make up 5.5 hours of that by doing nothing more than just riding a train. Okay, so far, we have 3 groups traveling on 3 trains, and that was easy enough to understand. But here is where it gets tricky, and where I had a hard time following all of the action. The show did a good job of explaining it, but it happened so fast. I had a hard time processing it. But if you got it, then I applaud you. I struggled and had to watch this part multiple times to get it. So I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. On train number 1, the 8 teams arrived in Berlin, but all of them got off at the wrong station. They got off at a stop before the one they had tickets for. This is even after the ticket agent in Amsterdam had warned Nat and Steph not to get off at the main station. A navigational error by all of those 8 teams. Now, 5 of those teams, Izzy and Paige, Christine and Rubina, Jack and Chelsea, Tucker and Eric, and Hannah and Simone, were able to quickly get on a later train to the right station in Berlin. They just continued on with their original plan, but just slightly delayed. However, they needed to get new tickets to Dresden because the delay meant that they would miss their original connection. Even after this, they still expected to get to Prague at 9:23 a.m. So those 5 teams were happy about that. Meanwhile, the other 3 teams on Train 1 who got off too soon, which were Jazz and Jag, Joseph and Adam, and Nat and Steph, decided not to get back on the same train they had been on, but instead to buy tickets for another train. That was potential disaster. They had been in the lead, but now faced uncertainty. Yet somehow they found tickets for a train that arrived in Prague at 8:12 a.m., just over an hour sooner than originally planned. So getting off the train at the wrong station in Berlin was perhaps a really good thing, by accident. So those racers were really happy too. Moving on to train number 2, the 3 teams, Angela and Lexi, Kylan and Taylor, and Kat and Alex, arrived in Frankfurt on time and waited for their connecting train. So far so good. But then, the Frankfurt curse struck. At first the connecting train was delayed, causing some concern. But then it was outright canceled. Teams froze. They didn't know quite what to do. But they quickly gathered themselves and were able to get tickets on the train to Regensburg, the same train that Megan and Matt were on, arriving at Prague at 10:22 a.m. On a side note, one thing I noticed was that some teams seemed to be riding the train in economy class, while others were in first class. Or maybe all were in first class. In any case, this is different than if they were traveling by plane. As I understand it, racers are not allowed to buy first-class plane tickets. They have to buy economy tickets, but they can move up to first class if it's free. The rules are different for other modes of transportation, as I've read, that do allow first-class tickets for racers on trains. All right, so after all of that, what started out as 3 groups of teams on 3 separate trains, split into 4 groups, then reformed back into 3 groups, with them arriving in Prague at 8:12 a.m., 9:23 a.m., and 10:22 a.m. respectively. Whew, what a complex set of actions. And as I often say, there's no need to seek adventure when you travel, because when you travel, adventure finds you. Okay, arriving at 8:12 a.m. as expected, Jazz and Jag, Nat and Steph, and Joseph and Adam raced off the train as their crew had told them to take the metro and then go by foot to a television tower in Prague. The tower wasn't a metal skeleton-looking structure like I'd expected, but was a modern tubular one. In addition, an artist had placed large, solid statues of babies on the tower, making it look like they were crawling all over it. A height challenge to be sure. Who wants a breath of fresh air was the question to the racers on this roadblock. And a roadblock is a challenge that only one team member can do. The challenge was to walk out onto a plank made of metal grating and retrieve a streamer hanging below the very end on a rope. The task was to walk to the end of the plank, bend down or sit down, grab the rope, pull it up, remove the streamer, rise up and walk back, all with really nothing to support you but that narrow plank. It looked very difficult. Sheesh, my stomach dropped as the camera showed the challenge from different angles. They used a wide angle shot to exaggerate how far the racers had to go to get to the end, and it was very effective. The plank looked to be about 15 to 20 feet long. It was 255 feet above the ground and was maybe only 12 inches wide, just wide enough for your two shoes. It seemed to be suspended in mid-air with no handrails. There were 2 overhead ropes attached to the racers for safety, and I suppose a racer could use this as a third point of contact to provide some stability. On the first 3 teams, Adam, Steph, and Jag performed the roadblock. Jag had no issues walking out there and back. He was there and back in no time, finishing that first task. Steph had some trepidations, but made it okay. It was Adam who had difficulty, but Joseph talked him through it, and he made it. I'd have to admit, I'd have a lot of trouble with that task. But if babies can crawl all over it, then anyone should be able to do it also. Jazz and Jag finished first, and the clue told them to take the metro and then go by foot to Charles Bridge and find the clue box next to the statue of Emperor Charles IV. Steph finished right behind Jag, and Adam was not too far behind. In fact, the 3 teams arrived at the clue box at the same time. The clue directed them to a local pub where they would face a detour. The teams had to pick either Remember the Chair, a memory challenge, or Handle with Care, a navigation and delivery challenge. Meanwhile, train number 2, with 5 teams on it, arrived in Prague, although I couldn't see when it arrived, but it was supposed to arrive at 9:23 a.m. Those teams raced to find the tower. However, Hannah and Simone fell behind because they left the train station looking for the metro, not realizing the metro was in the same train station building, so they had to go back and catch up with the others. On train number 3, Megan and Matt realized there were 3 other teams on their train, and as a result, more screaming, hugging, and crying occurred during the reunion. Sheesh, I could understand why Megan and Matt would be happy to see the other teams, but why were the other teams so glad to see their competition? Back at the bridge, all 3 teams decided to do the Handle with Care detour, and off they went, together, to find a glass shop. Meanwhile, the train number 2 team started to arrive at the tower to walk the plank. When Chelsea arrived, she said it was iconic. Oh boy, that word seems to be the trendy word these days. I hear it and see it written everywhere. Iconic has become ubiquitous. Seriously, everything can't be iconic. I am hoping that ubiquitous becomes the new trendy word so we can say, I'm seeing that word everywhere. Anyway, at the glass shop, the teams had to gather a specific number of specific colors of Bohemian glass goblets and deliver them to 3 customers. It required careful planning, attention to detail, and walking navigation to perform correctly. Meanwhile, back at the tower, Tucker, Jack, Paige, Rubina, and Hannah walked the plank without much drama or difficulty. Teams commented on the cemetery below them, with Tucker saying that if he fell, at least he would land in the right place. I think it might be better to put a mattress factory down there in case something goes wrong. Jazz and Jag finished the glass delivery detour first and had to travel by foot to a statue next to a museum for their next clue. Nat and Steph finished that task next, with Joseph and Adam right behind them. They got delayed because a random cafe owner, not part of the race, motioned for them to come inside, The teams weren't happy that they were duped in such a way. The clue at the statue directed them to the pit stop to see Phil. The train number 3 teams arrived. Again, I couldn't determine when they arrived, but assumed it was as scheduled at 10:22 a.m. Off they went to find the tower. They were traveling as a group, but Taylor realized that at some point it would be every team for themselves as they battled it out not to be eliminated. Kylan, Alex, Matt, and Lexi walked the plank. Lexi had some difficulty, with her mom Angela unable to watch as she did it. But she made it. It was Matt who had the most trouble, but Megan was very supportive, and he inched his way there and back. Meanwhile, Jazz and Jag arrived at the pit stop to claim first place on leg number 2. They sprinted up the stairs with great energy. As a result, they won Expedia points towards a 9-day trip to Sri Lanka. Tucker and Eric arrived at the statue and read the clue directing them to the pit stop. Uh-oh, they missed the previous clue box at the bridge, directing them to the detour tasks. Ha! They were so happy they were on their way to the pit stop, commenting that this was unbelievable and thanking Phil and the Amazing Race for the short leg. But we knew better. Nat and Steph, and then Joseph and Adam, arrived at the pit stop to claim second and third place respectively. They too had high energy as they finished. Tucker and Eric then arrived at the pit stop, and when Phil told them they were the 4th team to arrive, they celebrated, bro-hugged, and generally were feeling pretty good. Then came the dreaded "however" from Phil, who gave them the bad news and sent them back to complete the detour. Tucker and Eric found the correct clue box just as the others from their train had also found it. All 5 teams decided to do Remember the Chair. It was Hannah and Simone who completed that next, and they sped off to find Phil. Tucker and Eric finished the task next and passed Hannah and Simone to the pit stop because they already knew where it was. They finished 4th, the same place as they had when they first arrived. It's amazing they still beat all of those other teams, even after stopping to get some ice cream. Christine and Rubina had trouble with the task because they mixed up their crests, but were still ahead of the last group. The last 4 teams arrived at the bridge clue box, and in the end, it was Angela and Lexi and Megan and Matt fighting for the opportunity to race again in the next leg. Both teams chose Remember the Chair. Which team would be eliminated? Who had that killer instinct to outcompete the other? Well, neither one, actually. Angela and Lexi finished Remember the Chair first, but both teams left the task together, like they didn't realize the stakes. Both teams walked to the pit stop, Megan and Matt leading. At the pit stop, Megan and Matt came in 11th, physically exhausted, barely able to stand as they stepped onto the mat. Angela and Lexi, well, they came in last and were eliminated. Okay, so what can we say about this leg? First, Jazz and Jag have shown little signs of weakness during the first 2 legs. They came in first on both of these first 2 legs. They have navigated well, performed the tasks with little difficulty, and even had some luck on their side, and have maintained a good relationship with the other teams, all of which is very hard to do. Their biggest mistake so far? Getting off at the wrong station in Berlin. But somehow, they found a faster train, which propelled them even further ahead. Will they continue to dominate? Or will they run into a situation that slows them down? Remember, they still have an express pass. The second observation is the contrast between the leaders and those at the back of the pack. Jazz and Jag arrived at the mat with high energy, no sign of fatigue, no sign of exhaustion. Sure, they were breathing hard, but they still had plenty of fuel left in the tank. Even Tucker and Eric, despite all of their running around to redo part of the race, had spirit and confidence. At the other end of the scale, Megan and Matt seemed to barely make it to the pit stop mat, all hunched over and spent, riding on fumes, as they say, when you're about to run out of gasoline. Angela and Lexi weren't much better off. Earlier in the race, Angela needed help on the moving escalator. Third, the thing that is odd is that the teams only had to do 2 tasks, the roadblock at the tower and one side of the detour. Normally, teams do 3 tasks on a leg. I suspect there were 3 tasks planned, but the clue at the statue, which told them to go to the pit stop, originally had directed them to a 3rd task. Now, I'm only speculating, but it seems like the clue was switched at the last minute, skipping a task to shorten the day. Perhaps, and again I'm just speculating, the last team arrived much later than the 10:22 expected arrival time, and that's why the time was not shown on the screen, and why there was not a 3rd task. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. And lastly, there has been a lack of equalizers in the race so far. The only one I can recount is when they all met up at the start line after completing the sled bowling task. Teams are spread out with Jazz and Jag pulling further ahead. I predict we will see an equalizer during the next leg, where teams get all bunched up again and all restart at the same time. Okay. Okay, folks. I'm getting the signal to wrap up this episode. The whole mix-up on the trains was complex, at least for me, but it was like old-school Amazing Race delays at the airport, only cheaper. Prague looks like it's a very nice place, and as always, the Amazing Race finds some pretty cool places to visit. Thanks for listening, I really do appreciate that, and join me next time on Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38 as we explore what happens to our racers next. See you soon.